Hello, everybody. Welcome to Lit Fic at our special time on A Mighty Blaze. A Mighty Blaze was sparked when COVID-19 extinguished the traditional in-person book tour. With all those authors that didn't have that option anymore to promote their books, our co-founders, Jenna Blum and Caroline Levitt, joined forces to promote books coming out and promote new authors. Welcome to Lit Fic. I'm Bo Ellis. I'm the Facebook director of The Blaze, as well as a producer here. This week we have the amazing author Andrea Dunlop, author of Women Are the Fiercest Creatures. Andrea Dunlop is an author and consultant based out of Seattle, Washington, and she has over a decade and a half of experience in book publishing, as well as having published three other novels before. She's spearheaded many marketing efforts. She's done a lot of amazing things in this career and now speaks at several conferences as well as teaches. So we are super excited to have you, Andrea. How are you doing today? How is your tour going?
Thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here.
Yeah.
My tour is going great. I actually, you're just talking about how different things were for authors during COVID, and I managed to not because I planned it this way, but I managed to not actually launch any books during the worst of COVID. I had my paperback of my last book come out, but often do a lot of stuff for paperback releases anyway. So yeah, this is my first book in 4 years. So it's really been a funny time period to have in between books because obviously a lot happened. So I was in New York all last week. I did events in the city and in the New York area, and it was really so fun to just be out with people again, seeing people again. We had a big launch party with my publisher, Zibby Owens. This is the second book on her new publishing house, Zibby Books. And that was great fun. And it was just like, I had a couple of friends that came and they were like, oh, this is like the olden days, of having like a big fun party and everybody came out. And so things have been going really well. And it's a totally different experience being on my fourth book, and every book has come out during a really different period of my life because I've had 2 kids in the last 5 years. So it's just been a different experience every time. So this has been, I feel like my goal was to really just like have fun and enjoy myself again with this, and I feel like I'm having a great time. So yeah,
well, that's amazing. That's the most important thing, is to have actual fun while you're doing the thing you love, which is so awesome. And your book is amazing. How is working with Zibby Owens, this new publishing house?
It's been such a blast. Zibby she has really come onto the scene. Excuse me. Of course, I'm recovering from. Still, I have a cough from like my cold that I had 3 weeks ago, which has just been this entire winter.
Yes.
But fortunately, we're on Zoom, so I don't need to like give you the whole like I don't have COVID. Don't worry, I've been tested anyway. No, Zibby is fantastic. She started this new house, and we, just submitted to her, and I was so impressed when it was her and Lee Newman at the time when they told me about their company and their plans. And so it's, she is like kind of an insider and an outsider because she's, really come onto the literary scene in the past 5 years with her podcast, and she's met all these authors, and she's really been doing a lot in that space. But, she's not someone that like came up in traditional publishing. And so she just has all these new ideas. And that's, as anyone who's been kicking around the publishing industry for as long as I have knows, publishing, as much as like, I love publishing. I love publishing people. That's where I started my career. It's full of just like brilliant, amazing people. But a lot of the systems are very antiquated, and it's not a great industry for like moving quickly with the times or adopting new ideas. It's kind of a very old school, old New York, let's do things the way we've always done them kind of industry. And so, it's been really fun working with Zibby's team. They've had all these great ideas. They did fantastic events for me in New York. We partnered with a fantastic yoga sort of entrepreneur, this gal named Tara Stiles, who has her own yoga brand called Strala, and they have studios all over the world that are affiliate studios, and she has a big following, and she partnered with me for a bunch of my events and is doing a book club around it. And it's just such a like fun thing that I don't know that like I don't think that a traditional publisher usually doesn't kind of bring those things to the table, right? The idea of these partnerships. We did this partnership with Citizens for Humanity, where that shirt, by the way, is still available. They did a shirt that says "Women are the fiercest creatures," and all the proceeds go to Girls Inc. In LA, which is a great charity. So it's just like these things that are really out of the box ideas that they really executed on. And that's just been exciting for me as a person who's been, working in kind of the book marketing space for a long time and trying to do some of those things on my own. So it's been really fun to have a publisher that's excited about those new ideas. And they're just all, it's like there's a lot of the enthusiasm and just they're only doing one book a month. So every title feels like a lead title. So they've really done a great job of like making it feel fun and special again, which it should. I mean, it's sometimes like, and any author that's been around the block a little bit will know, we all get together and like can get very grumpy about being authors, which is funny because of course this was all of our dream before we did it. And so so it's been a nice experience for me to just remember, like, it really is a special thing to have a book out in the world. It's really amazing that people will spend their free time and hard-earned money to like spend time in my imaginary world, and that's a really special thing. And I feel like I'm kind of at a point in my life where I can like take a step back and appreciate that again in a way that I've been just like too angsty to do on the last couple of books for a variety of reasons. So
life never stops coming, especially when you have a family and you have amazing work happening. But I also threw in the comment section the link to Tara Stiles' website and also the link to that amazing shirt in case anybody wants to check those out.
Thank you so much.
Yes, I always love to make sure we have all those things mentioned available. But I did think what was interesting is that the title of your book is maybe something that some publishers, speaking of like how it's kind of a little antiquated, it's a little less edgy, Women Are the Fiercest Creatures, I feel like is a title that a lot of people would have shied away from. So that was something that I wanted to ask right off the bat. Did you choose that title thinking it might be controversial?
It's funny that you say that. So I'll tell you the origin story of the title is really kind of funny. So that was not the title that we had on submission, but titles are so funny because you either get it right away, either you just like have a great idea for a title and that one sticks and everyone loves it, or you have like a million iterations of it. And this was one of the cases where we had a lot of conversations about the title. And Lee Newman, who was my editor on the book, when she was with Zibby, she read it and she said, "Oh, we have to change the title. We have to call it Women Are the Fiercest Creatures." And and she goes, after that thing that Sam says, which is my main character, who says to her class. And I was like, it wasn't actually the line. The line was something different. But Lee remembered it as Women Are the Fiercest Creatures. And I was like, well, that's better. So we should just change the line. And I was like, that's a really good title. So I love that title right away. And I mean, I think it is, it's sort of mildly provocative. I mean, it's funny because I did, a whole bunch of like radio interviews a couple weeks ago, and I had a couple of male hosts that were clearly like a little, about the title. And that just kind of made me laugh because I was like, well, it's like, I don't think, the ethos of the title is really about like, really comes from my experience with having kids. And it's something that, Sam says, my yoga instructor character says to her prenatal yoga class. And she's trying to remind them that actually like this act of carrying a pregnancy and going through childbirth and becoming a mom is an incredibly powerful act, physically, emotionally. It's really like, I never felt stronger than when I gave birth. And I know that's not everyone's experience. And I was very lucky to have had an experience that felt really positive and empowering. I wish that for every woman that gives birth. And I know that's, having heard plenty of other stories, I know that's not always the case. But for me, it really like that experience really reframed the whole idea of strength. Because I thought, okay, like, yes, like men have superior upper body strength, but you can only look at them as stronger if you see it in that very narrow context, right? Because as I'm sitting here going through, I mean, childbirth is just a very intense physical experience. And you just think like this takes, I'm a former college athlete. Like I've always been into exercise and working out and stuff. And I just thought like, this is the most like physical experience I've ever had in my life by like a huge factor. And you're just like, oh my gosh, women are just out here doing this like all the time. The most ordinary woman in the world does this. And it's sort of like people treat it like it's kind of no big deal. And I didn't find the conversations around it to have like the gravitas that it deserved. And so that's kind of where that idea comes from. And I guess if people find that idea controversial, well, okay. I mean, and of course I've been asked to like that question of like, well, do you think like, your books are really more for women? And yeah, of course, like, because women are by and large, 70% to 30% the people who buy novels, period. And yeah, I mean, that's my perspective that I'm coming from. I don't think that you have to write books for everybody. In fact, I think that's like a bad idea to try and write books for everybody. So, if men are interested in the experiences of women, then I think they should read my books. And if they're not, then they're probably not my audience.
That is an incredibly fair way to look at it because, and I definitely agree with that. Books have audience. And I feel like your career in marketing also has maybe helped that really you have an audience and that's who you can focus on. You don't need to, if you try to appeal to everybody, you end up with the most bland nothing on earth, essentially.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And I think, it's, I know you write, we were chatting before the broadcast, you write in a specific genre, right? You write in horror, you write in speculative fiction. And for me, I'm in this sort of space that they call upmarket fiction or women's fiction, which is the worst title to call a genre ever because it could not be less specific. Again, like the vast majority of people reading novels are women, so that doesn't tell you anything about what a book is. But it's sort of this space where it's like, you're not super commercial, but you're not super kind of capital L literary. And like, yeah, you can't like write for every audience, and you're not gonna please everybody. And so yeah, I sort of think, especially being on book 4, I feel like I know who my audience is, and I also just believe in writing what you want to write. I mean, this is not a worthwhile career if you're trying to write to sort of, if you're trying to write to like follow a trend or like to write like someone else. You have to write what you're interested in. If you're not interested in your own characters, you're not going to write a good book, and it will just be a slog to sustain that through all of the many hours that you have to spend doing it. So, I think it's always up to the audience to choose what they like and what they don't like. And if they like my books or not, in some sense, it's sort of not my business. I do my best to like try and reach the audiences that I think will be interested, but nobody knows for sure.
Which is a great way of looking at it and keeping your kind of head on your shoulders about it. I also find it fascinating that there is a group called upmarket or like women's fiction when, like you said, women are the primary readers. That's just how it is. It's also fascinating because I wonder how many books would be considered literary fiction until they just have a female protagonist and then maybe get slid over into women's fiction, because I would consider your book, more literary fiction if they asked me right now, like, what would you have labeled this book? That's what I would have labeled it.
Yeah. And I mean, it's really these distinctions. I think genre can be very helpful in terms of describing some books, right? I think like you can say, and I'm very fascinated by genre and genre writers because it's like a very different approach, right? If you start looking at things like romance, where they have these tropes, and we use tropes a lot of times in like a negative connotation, but like the tropes in romance are very deliberate, right? And they tell you what it is, and that's to telegraph to readers, this is a book for you. And so I think that's like so interesting that they are writing in this maybe more formulaic way, but it's very deliberate. And that's to, that's a specific way to give readers what they want. And then they sort of operate in those parameters. And so I think like when you're talking about genres in that way, it's super helpful. Or to say like, oh, this is a techno thriller, or this is a horror novel, where you're really fitting into these kind of genre conventions. And of course there can be, all kinds of creativity and just expansive things going on with the writing within very specific conventions. But if you're outside of that, yeah, I mean, how you get described, I think, can say just as much about what people assume about you as an author. Like, does that person have an MFA? Do they come from that background?
Yeah.
Sort of like, you know, who are they? Like, where are they coming from? You know, what I think, like, all kinds of factors, gender and race and all kinds of things, like, factor into like what genre we say someone is. And I used to get a little more hung up on this when I was younger. And just, I think, like, people sort of think like literary means like higher quality. And I don't really feel that way anymore. I think that, like, and I read a lot of literary fiction. I read a lot of commercial fiction. I try and read just kind of like all, you know, I try and read kind of whatever sparks my interest, and I like to read different genres. And if something gets really popular, I like to read it to see what readers are connecting to. But yeah, I mean, I think that's very valid. Something that I've thought about a lot, and I don't want to pick on this book because I love this book. But the book Less by oh my gosh, now I forgot his name, which is not because Sean. Oh my gosh, help me out. Do you know what book I'm talking about? Less and Less is Lost. And I just read Less is Lost. And they're both Andrew Sean Greer. Thank you.
Yes,
Andrew
sorry,
Sean Greer.
I just looked it up.
Yes.
Andrew Sean Greer.
Yes, I knew that was in my brain somewhere. So Andrew, if you happen to be listening, I love your work. And this is, again, not a knock on him at all. I think he's a fantastic writer. I think this book deserved a Pulitzer. But I remember reading Less and thinking, this is essentially a romantic comedy. I mean, this is essentially, you know, that's the story. It's a love story. Yes. I have trouble fathoming a female author that would get Pulitzer consideration for writing a romance story or a love story. I mean, it's not romance, sort of genre romance, but it is, to me, I read that and I was like, this has a very strong central love story. And if it was written by a woman, it would absolutely be slotted into like, this is a romance book. And this is a sort of, you know, like, it's like, you know, Emily Henry's novels, right? And like, she's a great writer. Those are, so again, it's nothing about the quality where we're putting these, but it's hard for me to imagine, like, I mean, I think Emily Henry deserves a Pulitzer, but it's hard to imagine getting that same sort of like the sort of prestige look and the sort of award consideration. And I think those things are really still very gendered. And so for me, that's not something I have control over. I'm not really waiting for like a call from the Pulitzer committee. Like, I'm here if you guys want to call me. But, you know, it's, I think that we do like really look at, I think there is some gendered stuff to that. And also just like, you know, I love reading books that have a strong propulsive plot that keep people turning pages. That's the best compliment a reader can give me if they say like, oh my God, I read your book in like one day or like 2 sittings or whatever. I mean, I think that's like, then I feel like I've really done my job. And so I also think that sometimes we think of literary fiction as being less plot driven. I mean, there are some literary, like capital L literary writers. I mean, Ian McEwan tends to write like very plot driven books, in my opinion. I always think his plots are like very strong. But, you know, I also think that sometimes if you have like, if it's very plot heavy, then sometimes people are like, oh, this is like a little more commercial. And so, I mean, I could talk about this issue all day, but I do think like I think these genre conventions are interesting. I think it's interesting how people talk about them, but I don't think it's necessarily helpful to a reader to say like, this is upmarket fiction or this is women's fiction. It's not really telling a reader anything about what their experience is going to be.
Yes. That is all an excellent point. And we also got this great comment that nobody calls.
Nobody calls.
Yes, which is very
Maybe
true.
We should start. If anybody is out there dating straight men and they say they love Bukowski, be like, oh, you're a romance reader. Please do that. Film their reaction. That makes my whole day. Thank you so much for that comment.
No, amazing. Very amazing for sure. Okay. Yes. So I was wondering, there's a big aspect of Silicon Valley and the sort of Silicon Valley's takeover of Seattle, Washington, which I know is where you live, and the way women get pushed out of the tech industry in your book. Was that inspired by a real life story or just the general kind of plight of women in tech?
I mean, more the latter. I do think there are some specific tech and tech adjacent characters that really played into this. I mean, one was, I want to say her name, I think is Whitney Wolfe Herd, who was the founder of Bumble, who was one of the original founders of Tinder, and then was in a romantic relationship with one of the other founders and kind of got pushed out. And that was a really interesting story to me. And obviously, like, Bumble has been massively successful, so good on her. But I think it was, yeah, I mean, and then just looking into the history of women in tech, I read a fantastic book called Brotopia that I highly recommend. It's very readable, and it's like all about sort of the evolution of kind of computing and computer programming, and how originally that was looked at as women's work because it was seen as sort of secretarial. And then it really got, you know, women started to get really shoved out of it. And I think, you know, because of the money, because of the opportunity for money that was in there. And then all of a sudden now we sort of think of the programmer type as like some 25-year-old kind of antisocial guy in a cave, right? Which which really has no bearing on, like, there's no reason someone with those attributes would be a better programmer than anyone else. And so I thought it was really interesting to kind of look at that and sort of dig into those origins. And then, you know, the other fact that I really stuck out at me when I was doing a little bit of research on the tech industry and all the sort of VC funding, which is top of mind for everybody because of all the Silicon Valley Bank shenanigans the last week.
Yeah.
But, you know, it's less than 2% of female-led startups get venture capital. And I expected the numbers to be bad, but that is just like truly pathetic. And so I think like it just was really interesting to me to think about this archetype of like the male tech founder that's so omnipresent, and that really was like an omnipresent thing for my generation. You know, I'm about to turn 41, so I'm like 1 or 2 years older than Mark Zuckerberg, and just kind of like watching the trajectory of some of these guys, and also especially like how they get treated differently in like a family context. You know, I was very interested. Like, I read Small Fry, which is Steve Jobs' daughter's memoir, which is a great memoir. I recommend. And it's basically about how he let his, you know, eldest daughter grow up in poverty while he was becoming one of the richest men in the world. And people sort of know that about Steve Jobs, but it's not the top line of what anybody thinks about Steve Jobs. They think about his work and what he's accomplished, and he's still very venerated, even though, you know, all of this stuff about how he treated his employees, how he treated his family members has been pretty out in the open, and people just don't care as much. And I think like women are just get judged completely differently on how they are as parents, especially, you know, how they are as mothers, but even just sort of like how they are on an interpersonal level. I just don't think, you know, and obviously we have had some like famously bad kind of girl boss disaster tech bosses that have gone down in the last 5 years. And, you know, the reaction to those kind of, there's always an air of like, well, this is what happens when we let women do things. You know, it's like so, I mean, it's just a very different sort of double standard. And the other person I thought about a lot was Elon Musk, who has, you know, a famously, you know, he has like 1 million kids by different people. And I just thought, like, if a woman did this, like, that's all we would ever talk about. Like, no one would care sort of what else she was doing if her personal life was this messy. So yeah, I mean, I there were some specific people. Nobody is sort of like based off of anybody. And Jake, my tech founder in the book, is sort of, his whole thing is like, he's like, I'm not as bad as those guys. So like, I am like Mr. Feminism because I'm just not like quite as blatant of a misogynist as these other guys. So, you know, the bar is in hell. But yeah, so I mean, and certainly like, you know, it's very much like in the air in Seattle. You know, tech has become such a big thing here, and it's really changed the city. It's, you know, really dramatically increased our income inequality, and it's exacerbated our problems with like, you know, people being unhoused and all of the sort of ills that brought to San Francisco. It's brought to Seattle in a big way. So yeah, that certainly was a huge influence.
No, I know it's so hard. We were talking in general about how quickly things change now, where everybody lives. It's so hard to watch a place you love just seemingly overnight. You're like, wait, when did it get this bad? Because it wasn't.
Yeah, it does. And I mean, I think everything, you know, especially over the last few years, right? Like Seattle was, we had the first couple of recorded cases of COVID. We certainly didn't get hit as bad as places like New York City. And I have a lot of friends. I used to live in New York, and I have a lot of friends there. And that was like such a different experience, because I feel like in New York, sort of everyone knows someone who died, and it's not quite the same here. Yeah, I mean, from the COVID stuff to, we had a lot of protests and unrest here, over the summer of 2020 and beyond. And we just have had a lot of upheaval. A lot of businesses have closed downtown for sort of like a whole bunch of reasons. So yeah, things really did. It does look kind of unrecognizable from the city that I grew up in. And that's a hard thing to watch, because you love your city and you want it to do better. And these problems are incredibly complex, and it really is. But you see, there is a real failure of the system when Seattle has, several of the richest people in the world live here. And you just sort of like, yeah, there's complexities, but at some point you're like, well, couldn't they just use some of that money to like solve all of this? Seems kind of straightforward. And in fact, it's been really interesting to watch Mackenzie. Oh, she's not Bezos anymore, and now I've forgotten her last name, but formerly Mackenzie Bezos, so Jeff Bezos' ex. She obviously left that marriage with a vast fortune and got right to work giving it all away, or giving a huge percentage of it away, and has become a massive philanthropist. And you're like, yeah, see, like, it's possible. You could just take some of that gigantic fortune and like start giving it to people. So
yes.
Yeah, it is possible. People pretend it's really complicated, but I don't think it's as complicated as all that.
No, I think it's convenient to say it's too complicated and you guys just wouldn't get it because, you don't, too poor to understand.
You don't have billions of dollars, and you just don't understand how hard it is when you have billions of dollars.
Yes. Yeah. No, it is fascinating. And I did, when that statistic came up that you mentioned that only 2% of women startups get funded, I had to pause and look that up, because I was like, there's no way that's correct. This has to be some kind of exaggeration. And then I found out, no, that is just the numbers. And it's so really dismal. And it's that fascinating thing of, like you said, it's seen as like, oh, when a woman's in charge, anytime a woman makes some kind of blunder, it feels like it's everywhere for the next 20 years. And
it's like, oh, we had Elizabeth Holmes and now everything is ruined and we can't let a woman run it.
Yes. No, the amount of times where I know some women who just stopped wearing like black turtlenecks because they're like, I know this is Elizabeth Holmes vibes. And so
and it's funny because there's been these concurrent scandals about like the WeWork guy and Samuel Bankman-Fried, but like those guys just don't get quite, like, they're not seen as quite as fascinating as people. And I mean, listen, I was very fascinated by Elizabeth Holmes. Like, I watched the documentary, I listened to the podcast, I read the book. It was a fascinating story, and she's a fascinating character. But I do think we have a particular like fascination with like, oh, this one woman broke through and she's a fraud. So, like there's just a lot more sort of fixation on her than there are on these guys that did just equally bad things. And it was the same thing of like them all pretending that there was something happening that there wasn't, and lying to investors, and just the same shenanigans. And I think because there's so many of them, and because they all sort of look identical, if I walked by Elizabeth Holmes on the street, I would know who she was. If I walked by one of these other goofballs, like I would have no idea, right? Like they just look like every other white dude in Silicon Valley or beyond. And so I think like they just all kind of blend together. And so we don't fixate on them as much. It's interesting.
Yes. No, it is for sure that where even you mentioning like the WeWork guy, all of that, like I can picture Steve Jobs, and I know what Elon Musk looks like, tragically for us all, but but the rest of them, no, I don't know. Yes, it's
right. Yeah. And like I always like I finally determined that Mark Zuckerberg does have children, but like I couldn't have even told you that off the top of my head. I'm like, does he? And then I'm like, does Jack from Twitter, like, does he? I don't think he has kids, but it's like, there's no way as a female felt like you would know, like you'd know
Mhm.
if they were a mom, because we just sort of factor that into every judgment we make about women, in my experience.
No, I absolutely think that is a true experience, that, men can be career focused. It's something that's been discussed so much, but it's really prevalent in a very thought provoking way in your book about how it's like, oh, these three very different mothers who get some focus time, more than three, but the main three I'm thinking of, who are all very different, and yet a lot of their focus is that they're a mother, and yet there's
Right.
one central man who is the father, and
Right.
he doesn't seem to have that focus.
Yeah, and I mean, I feel two ways about that, because I think
Mhm.
like there is, as much as like men are doing just fine and still running everything, so I don't know that they need me to feel sorry for them, but I do think that unfortunately, my own husband, who I am raising my two kids with, is nothing like any of the men in this book.
Yeah.
And, but like, it's interesting seeing how like his work sort of relates to him as a father, or just like this kind of assumption that like, like paternity leave is sort of seen still as this like superfluous thing, or like this like
Yeah.
big bonus if they give you any time off at all. And, it's like we do sort of shortchange men in their role as fathers sometimes, and don't think they're as necessary. And certainly, like, if you're looking at the other side of my work is, about Munchausen by proxy cases and talking to some of those dads, the courts still have like very strong biases against fathers. And so it's kind of a deeper thing. And I think like, we really shortchange men when we don't allow them to have the same level of bonds with their children, with other people, with their friendships, and so I think like it's one of those things where it's like, yes, patriarchy hurts women more than men, but it hurts men too. And I think like, being a father is really important. Like, I don't like, yeah, I think especially when your babies are really little, it gets pretty mom centric, but it's like, being a father is an important job, and it should be treated as important. And, like, I don't think that work should, like, I think it was just, I was struck too by like, I'm like, my work is very important to me, right? Like, writing is very important to me. My podcast is very important to me. These are projects I believe in and put a lot of time into. But I just really felt once I had kids, I was like, well, there really isn't anything that's as important to me as this anymore, right? Like, I made the choice to bring two human beings onto this planet, and like, there's could be no bigger job. And so I think we don't sometimes we're like, oh, it's the most important job for women, but like, we don't see it that way for men. And I think that sort of like, in some ways is like not very fair to men, right? Because being a parent is really important. And I think that we should make space for it. And I think like some people's jobs, maybe they're going to make more of an impact than they are on their kids. If you're, curing a terrible disease or something. But like, for the most part, I don't know that most people's work is more important than being a parent. So I think that just like something I thought about a lot while I was writing this book.
And that's definitely, I'm a person who is not a parent and don't personally have intentions of becoming one.
Right. And so that's just like a totally different path, right? And I have a ton of friends that are child free. I have like a lot of writers. No training for being a parent. It's on the job training. Indeed.
Yes.
It's intensive on the job training. Yeah. And so, I don't mean to say like, oh, being a parent is the most important job, but I think like, if you make the choice to bring a human being here, if you do not make that choice, then you are on your own reconnaissance, and you're finding, like meaning and work. And not to say that work isn't worthwhile, but I just think it's like, yeah, like once you decide to become someone's parent, that is a massive job. You will never have an impact on another human being the way that you do as their parent. And I think that's just, having seen, especially talking to, I on my other side of my work for my 501c3, I work with abuse survivors. And so those are someone that had the very extreme of someone not being a good parent. And you just think like, that impacts someone more than, really more than any other influence they could have in their life. And so I think that's like, I just think it's like, we sort of don't take it seriously enough, I think, to some degree, or we take it like we make it too big for women and not big enough for men. And I don't think that's really good for anybody.
No, and that's something where even though I don't have the experience of being a parent, I have the experience of having parents, which everybody, and it is, you know, people in my generation and the younger generation are all about, you know, how, you know, and sometimes talking about how messed up they feel by their parents. So they acknowledge this huge impact their parenting had on them. And yet we still sometimes try to shove parenting in this corner of like, well, parenting is what you do. You know, it's just not as important. It's not vital for men, and for women, it's your job. But also, you can't just define yourself by being a parent now if you're a woman. So, because that's bad too. So it's a kind of double bind.
Right. And like, I mean, it's like the way we talk to women is about parenting is sort of inherently condescending. And
yes,
that was something I experienced when I was pregnant. And it's like people talk to you like you're a child, and it's very weird. I'm like, this is the most grown up thing I've ever done. Like, I'm bringing a whole person here. And like, I waited a long time to do it so that I could feel grown up enough to do it. And yeah, I mean, you know, my mom was a stay-at-home mom. My father is an entrepreneur. Again, nothing like the male entrepreneurs in this book. But there's no way they could have made anything work if she had had a job outside the home. And so it's like, it's also that kind of just like all that invisible stuff that many women do to sort of support their male partners in their endeavors. And he certainly never could have had a family. And she's just taken care of, you know, sort of everything else that wasn't work over the years. And so, and that was for them, that was a good dynamic that worked well. But yeah, I mean, I have a lot of respect for women who are in that role. And I think they deserve like a lot more credit for all the things that get done because they're doing everything else, because they're, you know, it's like, we talk about these things like cooking and cleaning and like they should be, but it's like, those things have to get done regardless. Like someone has to do them to sort of keep things going. And so, you know, if it's not you and if it's your spouse, then you need to recognize. And I mean, I say this with my spouse that does most of the cooking in our house. Like, then you have to recognize that like someone is doing that. Like someone has to do that so that everything can keep going and so that you can keep doing your work. So if you think your work is important, then whatever your spouse is doing to support that work is equally as important.
No, that's absolutely so true. And it's I wrote a paper on this, like of historical authors like Leo Tolstoy, F. Scott Fitzgerald, who actually took a lot of writing inspiration from their wives or had their wives as editors or blatantly stole their wife's writing and passed it as their own. And yet they're still the famous ones.
Right.
And so it's so fascinating that so many men have, and even with scientific papers, this is a problem. Women edit them, women do part of the research, and then they just don't get the credit.
Right. I read a big thing about Albert Einstein's wife the other day, and I was like, I never knew any of that. Yes. I was like, well, and I was like, but I'm not surprised, because it's like, oh, do we really think like for all of history, women were just doing nothing else?
Yes.
And that they're like, women had no ideas or anything. It's like, no, they just got snatched by the closest male to them. And that's like, we just didn't give them credit. It's not like women just started doing things in the 1970s or whatever, you know?
Yeah, it is that.
That doesn't make any sense when you think about it. Yeah.
No, it's that very fascinating thing where people are like, yep, women just sat quietly and never said a word.
Just all
and they were
super content to be in the domestic role. Not a single one of them wanted to do anything else until all of a sudden feminism. And yeah, no, it's totally preposterous when you think about it. Yeah.
No. And I do feel that your book is really great and a great look at that invisible work, at the visible work that can be proven, some of the invisible work that everybody should sort of accept as common sense, and yet somehow we don't. But what do you feel that we should do, your readers and just the people out there, for kind of pushing towards making the world a more equitable place, and not just on the lines of gender, but also race? Racism is addressed a lot in your book as well. So
yeah, I mean, I don't think I'm necessarily the person with those answers. I think novels are better at asking the questions, right? And so there are certainly like just a ton of, a ton of activists that are working. I mean, we were chatting about this, you know, you're in Nebraska. I mean, could not be a more contentious time to be a woman in this country. And so I think it's incumbent on all of us to push back, to push back on people that are trying to take women's rights away.
Yes.
Really, it's very stark. Like, our human rights are under massive threat right now. And I think men should care a lot about that as well.
Yeah.
No state, no country is going to thrive if the women are not, if the women are disenfranchised. And that's been proven throughout history. You don't need to believe me on that. There's a lot of statistics to back that up. And I think, the same thing with racial justice. I think we just need to we did all have this moment post 2020. I think there's no excuse to not know how bad things are. And, certainly looking at when I look at statistics about maternal health, things are, we have much more sort of maternal death in this country than we should, given that we're allegedly advanced civilization over here. And then it's it's 3 times as bad for Black women or something like that. So it's all of those things. I think we need to pay attention to those things and push on legislatures. I think especially for those folks that are living in red states or purple states, or I think there was maybe a little bit of complacency for women my age because we were born post Roe v. Wade. We were born post Title IX. The feminists before us did incredible work to give us, something that looked like an equitable world or a more equitable world. And now all of those things are being attempted to be clawed back. And so I think it was very easy to sort of be all right, well, I'm going to, vote for this thing or vote for this person because I don't have to care what they think about abortion rights because it's not on the table. Well, we've all seen it's on the table now. I was holding my 9-day-old baby when Roe v. Wade was overturned, and
Yes.
and so I think, it's just we all need to pay attention and kind of and I'm guilty of this too, right? It's easy to just kind of let life kind of go by if it's not affecting your daily life, but I think it's going to start affecting all of our daily lives a lot more, and I think doctors are going to start leaving a lot of these states. Teachers are going to start leaving a lot of the states because of this nonsense over let's not ever teach anything about gender or race or whatever. So I think it's I think it's really just we're in for a big fight.
No, it's very true. And it's like you said, I live in Nebraska, for everybody out here who doesn't know that. And it's a crazy time to be here. And it is something where I have to bring that up every day. And I do that in my personal work. And I think that's an excellent answer, that we all have ways we can contribute to advocacy. And we should always make sure we are also listening to those around us with different experiences and making sure to make room and understanding that, every woman has a different story, a different perspective, and we need to make room for everybody. So.
Yeah. And I think reading diverse books is a great way. There's no better way to get, I think, novels and memoirs in particular, there's no better way to get in someone's head and walk in their shoes and build our empathy for other experiences that are not our own. So we should all be making sure that we're reading books from all kinds of different perspectives. And that's a really good and enjoyable, entertaining way to understand what's going on for people that are not exactly like us.
No, that's another fantastic suggestion. And I put all the books that you mentioned, I put a link to their bookshop in the comments. So if anybody wants to check those out, please do, because they all sound very interesting. Now I'm going to start winding us down. So I did want to ask, what are you doing next and where can people follow you?
Yeah, thank you. So I have a couple of new projects. Yes, there's my Instagram. Instagram's really the only social media I'm active on these days. So that is the best place to find me. And I am working on season 2 of my podcast, which is called Nobody Should Believe Me. Season 1 is out now. If you want to go binge, all 8 episodes are up. That is an investigative true crime podcast about Munchausen by proxy. Also working on a nonfiction book on that same topic. I am co-writing that with the detective who is featured on my podcast. So that should be out next year, probably. That's turned into a massive project, but I'm very excited about it. So those are the projects I have coming up. So everything really, I have everything on my little link tree in my Instagram. So that's just the best place to connect with me.
Perfect. And I did want to ask, I love asking this at the end, is there anything that I didn't ask that I should have? In case you want to talk.
This is great. You asked you asked great questions. This was really fun. I got to get on my soapbox about a whole bunch of things.
I love your soapbox. So I thought that was fantastic for sure. So thank you so much for joining us today. I loved having you. And thank you, Andrea, again. Check out Women Are the Fiercest Creatures. The link to that is also in the comments. Please read it. It's an amazing book that deals with all these issues we discussed and so many more. There's too much to fit into 45 minutes. And please remember to like, follow, and subscribe A Mighty Blaze for more blazing goodness. And we'll see you all soon. Bye.
Thank you.